While Donald Trump was issuing ultimatums and threatening Canada with comprehensive tariffs, something happened that nobody in Washington anticipated. Canada didn't impose retaliatory tariffs. They didn't ban exports. They didn't issue dramatic threats. Instead, they did something far more devastating to the American economy. They quietly withdrew from voluntary supply chain coordination agreements that have kept North American manufacturing running smoothly for 70 years. And within hours, the consequences began cascading through the American industrial system in ways that no amount of political spin can conceal. This isn't a trade dispute that can be resolved with a tweet or a press conference. This is the collision between political recklessness and economic reality. And it's happening faster than anyone in the administration expected. Automotive plants in Michigan and Ohio received notices that critical component shipments from Canada were being delayed indefinitely. Not canceled, not banned, just delayed in ways that destroy production schedules entirely. Because when you've built your entire manufacturing model around just-in-time delivery systems with zero inventory buffers, a delay of even 3 days might as well be a complete shutdown. You can't build cars without the parts. And when those parts are stuck at the border, 20,000 workers stand idle while their paychecks evaporate. Construction firms across the United States discovered that Canadian steel and lumber shipments weren't clearing customs on the timelines their contracts were built around. Projects worth billions of dollars suddenly face delays that trigger penalty clauses, cost overruns, and cascading failures across entire development portfolios. Energy markets reacted immediately as traders realized that guaranteed minimum flows of Canadian oil and natural gas were no longer guaranteed at all. The uncertainty alone introduced volatility into pricing models that depend on stability above everything else. Prices spiked not because supply actually stopped, but because the assumption of reliability disappeared overnight. What triggered this crisis wasn't a misunderstanding or a technical trade dispute. It was an ultimatum. Trump's administration presented Canada with what they called a final demand that Canada agree to restrict exports of critical materials unless American companies were given preferential access at below-market prices. Think about what that actually means. The United States government demanded that Canada sell its natural resources at a financial loss to satisfy a political narrative in Washington, not to address genuine shortages, not to stabilize markets during an emergency, but to force a sovereign nation to subsidize American industries by surrendering economic value that belonged to Canadian workers and Canadian shareholders. When Canadian officials examined that demand, they understood immediately that compliance wasn't just economically damaging, it was existential. Agreeing to those terms would have set a precedent that Canada's sovereignty could be overridden whenever an American president decided pressure was politically useful. That was the line Canada refused to cross. And the moment they refused, the fragility of the entire American production system became impossible to hide. This is where the Trump administration's fundamental misunderstanding of modern economics becomes painfully clear. Size does not equal leverage in an integrated supply chain. The country that controls critical inputs at strategic choke points often holds far more practical power than the final market, regardless of GDP comparisons, and Canada sits at precisely those choke points: energy, minerals, automotive components, construction materials. These aren't products American industries can easily replace. Not in weeks, not in months, and in some cases, not without massive capital investment that takes years to complete. The administration issued its ultimatum as if Canada had no choice but to fold, as if asymmetry of economic size alone guaranteed submission. But that assumption ignored a basic reality of modern manufacturing. It's a fragile choreography where one missing component can idle an entire facility, employing thousands of workers. As the disruption spread through the American economy, something unusual started happening in corporate boardrooms. Executives who had remained silent through previous Trump trade threats began making frantic calls to Congress and the White House, not to debate ideology or political strategy, but to explain cold operational facts. Factories would shut down within days. Workers would be furloughed by the tens of thousands, and competitors in Europe and Asia who weren't dealing with this self-inflicted chaos would permanently capture market share that American companies would never recover. These weren't hypothetical warnings designed to influence negotiations. They were accompanied by hard data, inventory counts, production timelines, contractual obligations that couldn't be met. The numbers showed exactly how little margin for error exists in the current system when a trusted supply partner suddenly becomes unreliable. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce issued emergency statements, Manufacturing associations released projections showing hundreds of thousands of jobs at immediate risk. Industry coalitions that typically avoid direct political confrontation began publicly demanding that the administration reverse course before irreversible damage occurred. And suddenly, the consequences of treating trade policy as performance art became impossible to ignore. Because when a factory stops operating, there's no narrative that fixes it. When a worker gets sent home without pay, there's no slogan that covers the mortgage. And when energy prices spike because supply certainty evaporates, American consumers feel it immediately in their heating bills and at the gas pump. What makes this moment particularly dangerous is that it follows a predictable pattern we've seen repeatedly: threats issued without exit strategies. Whether it was tariffs on China that ended with American farmers requiring government bailouts, or border threats against Mexico that nearly shut down automotive supply lines before business pressure forced a humiliating retreat. But Canada is fundamentally different from those previous confrontations. The level of economic integration is deeper, the reliance is more absolute, and the political will to submit simply does not exist in Ottawa. That combination creates a crisis that cannot be managed with bluster or last-minute deal-making. As real economic harm began materializing, Trump's own political coalition started fracturing. Republican senators from affected states publicly demanded immediate resolution. Labor unions warned of imminent mass layoffs. And business leaders who had once praised Trump's toughness began quietly distancing themselves, not because they suddenly discovered principles, but because their balance sheets were bleeding and their shareholders were demanding answers. This is the point where the spectacle of strength collides with the substance of governance, because dominance that produces economic collapse isn't strength, it's failure. The deeper problem, and the one that will outlast this immediate crisis, is the message Canada's response sent not just to Washington, but to every American ally watching closely. Economic integration with the United States now carries political risk that cannot be managed through normal diplomatic channels. And once that lesson is learned by governments and corporations around the world, it doesn't unlearn itself. Companies begin adjusting their supply chain strategies. Governments start diversifying trade relationships. Investment flows reroute toward jurisdictions where policy predictability still exists. And the world quietly begins building economic systems that do not depend on American reliability, because reliability is the true currency of power in global markets, and it's being squandered in real time. What we're witnessing is not simply a standoff between two governments. It's the exposure of a structural vulnerability that was always present but never tested at this scale. The vulnerability of an economy that assumed cooperation would always exist, even as it elected leaders who openly treated that cooperation with contempt. And the consequences of that contradiction are now arriving faster than anyone planned for, reshaping incentives, alliances, and strategic calculations across North America in ways that will not be easily reversed. Because once trust is replaced with contingency planning, once reliability becomes conditional, the old integrated system never quite comes back the same way. What makes this moment particularly destabilizing for Washington is that there is no clean exit, no graceful way to reverse course without acknowledging catastrophic failure. The entire strategy was built on the assumption that Canada would ultimately blink, that economic asymmetry alone would force compliance. And when that assumption collapsed, it exposed how little actual contingency planning existed behind the political bravado. The administration is now trapped between two equally damaging options: escalation or retreat. Both carry real political costs that can no longer be hidden from the American public. If Trump doubles down and imposes the comprehensive tariffs he threatened, the supply chain damage accelerates dramatically. Factories that are already teetering on the edge shut their doors entirely. Layoffs spread from the industrial Midwest into energy sectors and construction industries. Consumer prices rise further across multiple categories. And the narrative that this is all just a temporary negotiating tactic collapses under the weight of lived economic experience. Because Americans notice when their factories close, when construction projects stall, when their cost of living rises month after month. Those aren't abstract economic metrics that can be explained away at political rallies. Those are kitchen table realities that destroy political support. But if Trump attempts to de-escalate, to quietly walk back the ultimatum or negotiate some face-saving compromise, he faces a different kind of political reckoning. His entire political identity is built on the idea that he never backs down, that threats always produce submission, that American power is absolute. And any visible concession to Canada will be framed by critics and eventually by his own supporters as proof that the strongman posture failed when confronted with a sovereign nation willing to absorb short-term economic pain to protect long-term independence. This is where the damage extends beyond immediate economic shock and into the realm of institutional credibility, because allies around the world are not evaluating this crisis based on White House press briefings or political spin. They are watching outcomes. They are observing whether the United States can sustain integrated partnerships without weaponizing them, and whether American leadership understands the fundamental difference between leverage and self-harm. Inside Washington, the cracks are widening in ways that are deeply uncomfortable for a political system already strained by polarization. Trade experts who warned against this course of action are now being proven correct in real time. Lawmakers are scrambling to distance themselves from a policy they didn't design but must now answer for to constituents losing jobs. And the constitutional imbalance that allows a single executive to unleash this level of economic disruption before any meaningful check can occur is being scrutinized more intensely than it has been in decades. Because courts move slowly, Congress remains paralyzed by partisan division, and the economic consequences are immediate and devastating. What Canada did, whether intentionally or not, was force this crisis into the real economy where ideology matters far less than logistics. And once the crisis enters that space, it becomes impossible to confine it to political talking points. Because trucks not crossing the border don't care about messaging strategy, energy flows don't respond to rhetoric, and manufacturing assembly lines don't pause politely while leaders recalibrate their political narratives. The most consequential effect of this confrontation may not be what happens in the next week or next month, but what happens quietly afterward. American companies are already beginning to redesign their supply chains to reduce exposure to political volatility, sourcing components from alternative suppliers even at significantly higher cost, building redundancy and inventory buffers instead of pursuing maximum efficiency, shifting long-term investment toward jurisdictions where policy predictability still exists. And once those corporate decisions are made, they rarely reverse. The integrated North American economy that took generations to build begins to fragment. Not with dramatic announcements or headlines, but with thousands of quiet recalculations made in boardrooms across the country. Canada understands this dynamic perfectly, which is why Ottawa is not waiting for Washington to resolve its internal contradictions. Canadian officials are actively accelerating efforts to diversify trade relationships, deepen economic ties with Europe and Asia, and ensure that no future American ultimatum can carry the same systemic threat to economic security.